Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark, and today we are talking about Ukraine. We talked to two groups this week, both in swing states. One group was Trump 2020 voters, and a group of what we call internally flippers, people who voted for Trump in 2016, but voted for Joe Biden in 2020, and they generally identify as moderate Republicans. To break down these groups this week, I am super excited because Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman has decided to join me. Alex, thank you so much for coming on the Focus Group.
I'm actually super excited. I think I'm more excited. I think the show is terrific, and I am a big admirer of yours. So
I'm a big admirer of yours.
Well, then that works out well.
It does. Amazing. So listen, both swing state Trump voters and the Trump 2020 flippers, they showed no love for Vladimir Putin, which is noteworthy because polling before the invasion by YouGov and The Economist found that Republicans were far less likely to say that they view Putin very unfavorably than they were to say the same of Biden, right? They actually viewed Biden more unfavorably than Vladimir Putin. Additionally, Trump has refused to criticize Putin. Tucker Carlson's been essentially rooting for him as he brings the war to Ukraine. And there's been a vocal Putin fan club in MAGA world. If you remember back in 2018, you'd see at some of the Trump rallies, there'd be people wearing T-shirts that say, I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat. But let's start out by listening to some of the MAGA voters, and then we'll talk to some of the Trump Biden voters.
The most concerning issue at the moment is Putin going into the Ukraine, war crimes.
Putin's just crazy, and I think we have to be careful.
It could escalate very quickly. Putin's about as sane as Biden is, and that's not saying much. He's already gone off the rails and invaded a smaller country. Who's to say that he wouldn't use nukes?
The guy's a maniac, and he wants to grab power, as Trump tried to grab power.
To allow some tyrant to just start, and you've got this whole domino effect of all these former Soviet republics that finally have their own identities. What can we do to make this stop?
So a lot of these answers around Ukraine actually came up not when we asked directly about the conflict, but actually in the opening question where we just asked, how do you feel like things are going in the world? What are you worried about? A lot of them started out with their fears about Ukraine. But for you, who's been following this, I know, incredibly closely, was it at least good to see that these GOP voters across the board thought that Putin was a bad guy?
It definitely did. Really, I think there's something about the American spirit and American values and this David versus Goliath story that I sensed even before Russia invaded that the electorate, the entire population was going to reject. I remember having this argument with Tim Miller about the effects of this. And I don't think I was right, but I don't think he was right either. I think this issue is one that resonates. We don't like bullies. And I think it just is clear that Putin is a bully, and it's time that somebody stood up to him. So I think that was the appeal and the impact that that's going to have on people. Understand there's a pocketbook issue here. People understand that this has a risk of spilling over and drawing in U.S. troops and stuff like that. So I think that's right, that this makes sense that people are from all across the political spectrum are interested in this issue.
Yeah, I mean, no matter how much, because, there were differences in the groups in terms of how critical they were of Biden and where they were politically, but they were sort of universally pro-Ukraine, like in an emotional way, and I felt like I was kind of heartened by the way that it seemed to juice their love of democracy. And as you say, being on the side of the underdog, don't like the bully. And so I was heartened by that. But the MAGA voters that we talked to, they don't support Putin, right? But they do see Putin's invasion of Ukraine as more of a raw power move driven by Trump no longer being in office. And they were highly critical with their takes on how Biden is perceived by Putin. Here's some of those clips.
Putin called him out the other day, said our sources are aware that you're not the one in charge. You're not the legitimate president. Now, if Putin knows it, and I'm sure we know it, everyone else knows it too.
I also think when Trump was in office, he kind of subdued Putin and Kim Jong-un or the other guy in North Korea. I think he knew how to keep them level-headed more so, where I think They see Biden as just this weak idiot, and now's the time to strike, where I don't think they would have done that when Trump was in office.
I think Putin doesn't view Biden as a strong leader. And he also knows Biden isn't the one calling the shots. And so he acted, which is really unfortunate.
If Trump was president, Putin would have never invaded.
So, Alex, what do you think of this clearly internalized talking point on the right that Putin only invaded Ukraine because Biden is so weak and that Trump would have been so much stronger?
Well, I think it's absurd, frankly, based on my study of it. I think for me, there is a just completely solid logical thread between the damage done under the Trump administration and the opportunity that presented to Putin to attack Ukraine. So this idea that half of the electorate, half the political elites, the Republicans, were going to take a soft position on responding to Putin's aggression presented a major opportunity. That explains the why now of this operation that Putin's conducting. But I think from these folks that were speaking, my impression is that they've invested so heavily in Trump that there doesn't make a difference what he said even hours before the invasion, even if he was kind of cheerleading for Putin, that wasn't going to be enough. There needed to be something more significant. I think until something more catastrophic happens, like the US gets involved, or unless there's a humanitarian catastrophe, something like that might cause a break. But right now, there's just not enough there to indicate that it didn't happen on Trump's watch. It happened on Biden's watch. He's the one responsible. So I think it's easy to kind of draw the line there, even though it doesn't make a huge amount of sense to somebody that pays attention to this continuously.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wondered when this first started, like, oh, would this cause people to rethink this? Because the first time people heard Zelensky's name, it was in the context of Donald Trump being impeached for refusing to send weapons without Zelensky agreeing to dig up dirt on his political enemy, Joe Biden. And I guess I had wondered, like, would it cause some voters to remember that every Republican who are now standing strong with Zelensky, they are in fact trying to beat up Biden for being too weak, that they were the ones who let Donald Trump skate for leveraging Zelensky when he was just trying to protect his country. But it appears, maybe not shockingly, that people immediately found a way to frame what was happening through their own political prism. And for Democrats, they're like, of course they didn't invade when Donald Trump was there. They were getting everything they wanted out of Donald Trump at the time. And so Putin didn't need to invade. Whereas Republicans are saying, well, there was only 4 years where Putin wasn't actively being aggressive. You know, he was aggressive with Obama and now he's aggressive with Biden. It's because they're weak and Trump was so strong and so tough that they didn't invade then.
Yeah, except for the fact that he still conducted chemical assassination attempts and the war in Syria was ongoing, a whole bunch of other things that don't kind of jive with that. But I was thinking about this and they were all pretty consistent, the MAGA voters. But I still think that Trump is his own worst enemy. He has this kind of pie and he continues to section off portions of his electorate continuously without accumulating numbers. To me, he did that with January 6th and then with toadying or cheerleading for Putin. And now that there's a major war and a humanitarian catastrophe, some subsection of the MAGA voter is affected by this. So instead of like expanding his numbers when he's already kind of 7 million votes short, he keeps shrinking them. So I think there's something to be said about the fact he's reduced his base even more. And this hasn't played out. We haven't seen the end result here. We're only 2 weeks into the war. It's going to get a lot worse. And if there's a consistent effort on the Democratic side to remind people of the complicity of people just days before cheerleading and frankly undermining President Biden as President Biden was attempting to deter this war. You know, you have President Biden warning about disastrous sanctions. And then on the other hand, you have the Republicans and Tucker Carlson cheerleading and impeding the ability to pass a sanctions bill. So maybe some of that just hasn't played out yet. And we're just in the early days.
Maybe, but to your point about how it has the potential to cleave off, these swing voters, right? These are people who voted for Trump in 2016. You know, we asked why they voted for Trump in 2016 and then why they switched. And typically it was what we hear all the time from these groups, which is, well, he was a businessman. I thought he'd do something different. But then, he was just too much. He was out of control. He was an egomaniac. I couldn't take it anymore. So I voted for Joe Biden. And the swing voters are always so interesting because they've got some of that Republican-y stuff in there, like those talking points that you hear from the MAGers. You always hear like a slightly weaker strain of that with the swing voters. In fact, here, listen to how the swing voters talked about Biden and why Putin decided to invade now.
It's hard to argue with sanctions and sort of peaceful resolution. The interesting thing is I think about the timing of everything. I mean, in many ways, I think Putin decided to do this because his opportunity is that he sees Biden as a weak president and America is not going to get involved. And that's what, there is some major thunder. But I think like if Trump were in office, we might literally have started World War III.
When Biden came into office, I was thinking, all right, who's going to test him first? Is it China possibly invading Taiwan, or is Putin invading Ukraine? You knew one of them was going to come after him to test him, and here we have it.
The things that he's doing is, basically cutting off their money supply. The ruble is like worthless now, right? Like their economy is just falling to pieces, right? And so it's kind of a wait and see game. Is Putin just going to keep his foot on the gas pedal and just plow through Ukraine? Or is he going to realize like, hey, there's no political end game here for me?
So when you hear the swing voters, they're so interesting because they generally think Biden is handling things well. They approve of the sanctions. They're glad we're crippling Russia's economy. They're less susceptible to the idea that Trump would have been better. They're like not sure. Like, well, maybe Putin wouldn't have done anything because he's crazy, or maybe he would have started World War III. Who's to say? But we do continue to hear a little bit of that strain of Biden's weak. Yeah. Here's where I would ask you, how do you think Biden's doing on this so far?
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the shortfalls with certainly these swing voters, probably some of the Democratic base, even though they weren't part of the sample here, and maybe even some of the MAGA voters, because this came up, is the communication on this has been pretty weak. This is something that clearly everybody's concerned of, whether that's a pocketbook issue and it affects oil and gas prices or affects inflation, or this frankly misplaced fear of how this could spiral into World War III, warrants greater engagement from the president, from the secretary of state, and that's not happening. So I think that's a shortfall that could address a lot of these issues here. In terms of how he's doing, I mean, we like to think about 4 elements of national power: political, informational, military, and economic. Political, he's helped rally the world. Zelensky has actually been the driving force, but the president has also helped rally the world in the correct direction. Informationally, masterful with these declassification efforts, closing off options. Economic, masterful also, although again, Zelensky's been driving the train. We've been closely following, at times leading, the recent announcement on blocking oil trade. That's important, but we've all been working in concert. And I think part of that is because the groundwork that was laid in the weeks and months before this was so important. Where we're frankly falling short is on the military side. We're doing what we need to with regards to posturing forces to protect NATO in Article 5 and warn off further aggression, but we're probably not doing enough with regards to support to Ukraine, reasonable support, not provocative support, risk-informed support, on the basis that we thought that this was going to end quickly, and it's not. It's going to play out over the weeks and months, and I think Biden's going to take some hits for that, for not doing enough for the population of Ukraine that all Americans support, and we should be doing more to try to bring this to a quicker end by supporting Ukraine with weapons, and we're not. So I think that's the one area where I think we could be doing more. I think the American public, if we received the right kind of signals and the right kind of information, they would get behind it. And it actually would have the practical effect of ending Putin's aspirations of achieving his political aims, subduing Ukraine through military force. He's not in a position to do that really anymore. He didn't posture the military force to do so. I would say probably an A- on everything. And on the military side, in terms of bringing this war to a conclusion, a C or something like that.
Interesting. You brought up something at the top of your answer that was both in the swing state group, very clear, and also clear, I would say, across the board, both in Democratic focus groups, in swing voter focus groups that I've done, which is one of the main things that you hear that they ask for is just to hear more from Biden. It's always in there. They're saying, we're in the middle of this crisis. And they sort of don't always think like the State of the Union or something like that counts. Like they want to be communicated with in these moments and hear directly from him. In fact, here, let's listen to some of the swing voters talk about it.
A fireside chat is what you're talking about.
I don't think he's being very transparent about what he's doing. I agree that there are things that we don't need to know, but I would like to have a better idea of what he might be planning to do if, this happens or that happens. He was very vague on what sanctions would be taken.
Not necessarily a tougher attitude, but talk about it more directly, because really the only time I've heard him mention it has been in the State of the Union. I don't think he's had a speech or a direct statement about it. I think it's been his news secretary. It hasn't been him directly talking about it. It alone has just been part of a State of the Union.
Now, it's not quite true, right? Biden did make televised remarks about banning Russian oil, gas, and coal. But, he tends to do these conferences like at 2:00 in the afternoon. But in your ideal world, if Biden was communicating about this effectively, how would you like to hear him communicating? Like you just said, fireside chats. I have, in fact, I always said a fireside chat podcast would go a long way. Even if people had to opt into it and they weren't necessarily listening to it, something where people felt like they were being told directly seems like it could go a long way. What do you think?
Well, I think that we should recognize that we've now basically permanently in a state of a Cold War with Russia, and we're trying to avoid a hot war. And this is a time for leadership and for the president to step up and rally the American public, both to ease the blow of the economic fallout from this, but also to warn what is going on, what's at stake. And to me, I think this is just a tragic missed opportunity for the president to bring the American public together on an issue they feel that, they might not like his leadership, or there's still a divide between Republicans and Democrats, but everybody supports Ukraine. Everybody supports Zelensky. Everybody understands what's at stake with regards to freedom and democracy, something that seemed a little bit more conceptual just weeks ago. This is a huge missed opportunity for American leadership, and it could be in the form of fireside chat. It could be a weekly engagement on primetime news or something of that nature. It doesn't have to be long. Something where he's talking to the American public, where everybody's tuning in. Fox is actually covering the stuff too now, is important. And then maybe even a rally. Would be great to see kind of the president participate in a rally for democracy, a rally for Ukraine, and just move America away from some of the partisanship that we've experienced over the past several years. Because I think there's a lot of unity around this issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. The MAGA voters are probably never going to give Biden much credit, but if he was out there talking to people more directly, I do think it might blunt a little bit of what it's just replete through the Trump focus group, which is them saying that Biden is a puppet. There is somebody else controlling him. I hear this in the MAGA groups all the time, where there's this idea that like Joe Biden's not really in charge. And I think that this is a real opportunity for him to demonstrate that leadership that you're talking about.
Can I just say one point on this? Zelensky, nobody knew him. He was a foreign leader, and their initial impression, if they ever heard of him, was bad. I think this is actually something that could move maybe even some MAGA voters. I mean, there are some folks that are going to be way out there and not care, but engaging and showing some leadership here, again, could slice off pieces of that pie and make this portion of the electorate less, I guess, antagonistic. I still see that opportunity.
Totally agree. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some of those comments that Trump made around Putin's genius.
So do you ever listen to a Bulwark podcast but wish you could also weigh in with your comments or your questions? Join us for Thursday Night Bulwark. Every Thursday at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, join a rotating cast of Bulwarkers on Zoom to talk about the day's news or go deeper on topics that don't get their due in the fast-paced news cycle. Political news today is a lot of things, but it is not boring. And our team is here to help you make sense of it all. Thursday Night Bulwark is only available to Bulwark Plus subscribers, so join us at plus.thebulwark.com.
And we're back. So Trump has said that Putin was a genius for invading Ukraine and declaring certain portions of it independent. And even after some pushback, he doubled down, came out and said how smart it is for Putin to be taking over a country for $2 worth of sanctions and American leaders are dumb. And yet, the group of sort of diehard MAGA voters here, they saw no problem with those comments. In fact, they thought it was the media's fault for misreporting the way that Trump talked about it. Let's listen.
He's called Mr. Putin intelligent, a genius. By all accounts, Putin is intelligent and is a genius and is a tactical master. So he's not praising him. He's merely stating facts. It's like saying Hitler was a great leader. He was a great leader. So is Mussolini. They weren't the nicest people. I'm not inviting them to lunch this week, but he's not praising Putin.
I'm bothered by the way the media twisted it to make it, oh, it's Trump supporting Putin. That's how they're trying to make it look.
And here's what voters who flipped from Trump 2016 to Biden 2020 had to say.
Trump's not even president. He's not the president, and he didn't win. And he makes me feel good that I voted for Biden, right? Like he's just, something happens in the world, a freaking war, right? And he thinks it's his duty to give his opinion on what a great strategic leader Putin is or whatever. There's no consistency in that guy other than self-gratification through this power that he thinks that he has over people. Like he loves being seen as the world leader. I can't imagine Trump saying that as president. Like, wow, what a military genius. Like they're killing people, right? Like it's horrible.
I think his comments are disgusting. If you look back when he was in office, he praised Putin several times along the way. Nobody could really figure out why. If you remember John McCain, who was our senator in Arizona, McCain called out Putin years ago, calling him a thug and warning about him. And there's actually a street named in one of the Ukraine cities for John McCain. They considered him a hero. So he warned us about this guy. And Trump, of course, hated McCain, belittled him, even though he was a war hero. So I think any of Trump's comments now are disdainful.
So this is super interesting to me because among the swing voters, Trump calling Putin a genius, smart, appearing to praise him, they hated that. They thought that's like to your point earlier, these are the kinds of things that cleave those voters further away from Trump. Now, again, they identify as Republicans. They mostly identify as moderate Republicans, but they had always been Republicans historically. But this is where they just think Trump is gross and disgusting. But the MAGA voters, they won't hold Trump accountable for anything, right? And so when he calls Putin a genius, they are quick to tell you, nope, it's the media twisting things. What did you make of that?
I'd say that seemed to be consistent, but I was looking at the expressions of people as that question was being answered. And it seemed to me that that was just kind of the extreme. And some of them were kind of a little bit more dubious. And so again, it's part of this thing where Trump always is his own worst enemy. And this is one of those things that's going to have legs. This is not going away for weeks and months. And certainly the Cold War, the economic isolation of Russia, that's going to go through the 2022 election cycle. So I think this is one of those things that the Republicans that were touting Putin are going to have to deal with for the foreseeable future. And of course, to me, it's clear that Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson, Mike Pompeo, Ron Johnson, all these guys have blood on their hands because they are the ones that nurtured this idea that there would not be a lot of consequence to attacking Ukraine. They basically wandered into an ambush because in their world, in La La Land, things don't have consequences. But frankly, what American politicians and statesmen say matters. And it's being picked up by the Russian state media and stuff like that. And they thought this is going to be no big deal. And I think that they've dug a hole and they're going to have to lay in that hole.
Yeah, I would say that if the thing about Hitler and Mussolini, the biggest thing is you just don't want them at lunch. That's, that was something.
They're okay. They're I wouldn't want them to lunch, but yeah.
But smart guys. I will say though, there was a couple of guys in the MAGA group, as there often are, and a few women, just intensely connected to Trump. These people clearly watched a lot of Tucker Carlson, happy to apologize for Trump. And yet, to me, the silver lining was that they're Trump apologists, but they weren't Putin apologists. And I found that good, heartening. What about you?
There was another silver lining, actually. When it came down to their thoughts about the Ukrainian people and aid, all of them, every single last one of them were supportive. 6 out of 8, by my count, thought heavy sanctions were important. One person was kind of ambiguous, and another person was like, let's leave headroom for escalating sanctions.
And that's in the MAGA group. Yep,
yeah.
right.
And then and when it came to this question about refugees, what to do with the Ukrainian population, there was a deep admiration for this group, and they were like, welcome them in. Maybe it's the right kind of population. That's unfortunate. But I think there's something to be said about the spirit of the Ukrainian people capturing the imagination of the American public across the political spectrum.
I totally agree. I was actually really struck by that too. And frankly, there has been this, especially among the Tucker Carlson set, way of being like, well, before we do anything about Ukraine, we should be securing our own border. And people in this group were saying we shouldn't be taking illegal immigrants, but they were open to taking refugees. Let's listen.
Sure, why not?
Why not? We've taken refugees from every place.
We've taken from every other country in the world. Right.
But there has to be communication continually with these people to make sure they're going where they need to go, they're getting what they need to get, and not just blowing out all over the country and doing their own thing. You're going to be allowed into the US, but you're not a citizen. You can apply for citizenship, which again, anyone from another country can apply to be a citizen.
It really tells you something about the nature of the American people. I mean, they've been radicalized on the MAGA spectrum in a really nasty way. But when I talk positively about America and, the kind of people we have here, it's based on this notion. I mean, we tend to be a pretty big-hearted people. And I think, when people are in desperate need, some of that's colored by politics, but in general, I think we're welcoming.
I agree. And, there was even a suggestion that the moderator posed about, well, how should we welcome, are you talking about refugee camps? People are like, no, not refugee camps. That would other them. That's not right. This is one of the Trump voters.
That's old school. And I think if we were to do that now, I think it's more or less of a segregating them and putting a bad mark on them already, just by saying, we don't know what you're going to do, so we're just going to keep you right here and keep you, tied down. But if we want them to assimilate into our communities and to become citizens, to become productive citizens, we don't want them to feel like, oh, I'm the Afghani. Nobody even wants me here. No, come in. If you're going to be a productive person, come on in.
I agree that stuff is still really in there, even when they've been radicalized on certain things. And another place that I thought was a pretty interesting, positive way that all of these voters across both groups said that they would accept higher gas prices if it meant punishing Russia and helping Ukraine. Let's hear what they said about gas prices.
I mean, I'm following really great Ukrainian people on TikTok that are showing me the bombs. This is like pulling every heartstring that I have, and the little baby carriages that were lined up for Ukrainian refugees that arrived in Poland. Polish mothers left their old carriages. I'm literally like so touched by it. So, okay, I'm going to complain about $1 more per gallon. Like, please, we have our freedoms.
I am willing to pay more if it means that this country is going to be able to stand. To me, to risk that is just not worth it. I'm happy to pay more.
I would be willing to pay a little bit more at the tank, but I don't completely trust the gasoline manufacturers. I think they're using the daily news to artificially raise prices too high and deliberately cut back on production.
I totally understand and respect paying a little more to protect the Ukrainian people. I also understand as if I don't want to pay the higher gas prices, I can choose to stay home, and that still is helping to relieve some of the pressure and use those resources elsewhere. So, I fully support being helpful, and there's things I can do without even knowing it.
What's amazing to me is just last week, our episode was on economic issues, inflation, gas prices, housing prices. And we had just done a bunch of groups where we had talked about, those pain points. And when you asked people what they were concerned about, inflation and gas prices were way up at the top of people's lists of the things that they were concerned about. But what's amazing is that if you put it in the context of sacrificing to help the Ukrainian people or to punish Russia, it obliterated a lot of the concerns. Did that strike you as much as it struck me?
It did, actually. It's interesting how this is likely to have a maybe even a strategic effect on the 2022 election cycle, because if inflation is a huge concern, if the pump fuel prices are a huge concern, But now the blame for that is not on Joe Biden or economic mismanagement, but it's in fact on geopolitics, which it's always frankly been to a certain extent, macroeconomic issues like COVID, but it didn't resonate. This one's clearer. And the president actually, in one way, he's been doing a good job of saying this is going to have an impact on the pump. It's going to probably ease some of the criticism or some of the pressure on the candidates on the Democratic side that are running for office, because this is not going to be an issue that they get hit on. But I'll tell you, this is another thing that's been a little bit of a source of frustration. Yes, I guess it needs to be done from a political perspective, but the amount of time spent on talking about increased fuel prices when there's a major war going on, and we have probably more important things to talk about, like how do you resist authoritarianism and things of that nature. I guess it was, in my view, it was overplayed. Maybe that's misplaced. Maybe it was all conscious and with the effort of putting this on geopolitics and distracting to a certain extent from inflation. I don't know. Maybe that's too conspiratorial also.
Yeah, I don't know. Here's what I wonder. I wonder if, so a lot of the work that I do is around, right, the defense of democracy. And one of the things I always say is that voters don't care that much about democracy. It's like, they care, but it's like the air they breathe, it's the water they swim in, it's just sort of there and they take it for granted. And in fact, it's typically Republicans who are more exercised about quote unquote democracy because they think an election was stolen from them. But I have wondered, both in the way that you listen to these voters be willing to sacrifice for pain at the pump, which, I've just heard over and over again as like an issue, like a voting issue, like a top of mind issue. Now they're willing to sacrifice. Is it possible that what's happening in Ukraine provides context for Americans around democracy? Like, does it change that conversation?
I think so. This is something that, again, this is why I thought that, just watching these fools in the MAGA world, the president and Tucker Carlson talk about it. I was talking about this fact that this war was all but a certainty, and just watching these guys wade in there talking about, how we should be supporting Putin instead of supporting the Ukrainians that are going to be taking the brunt of this seems like a fool's errand. But what this has done is clearly it's provided perspective. Democracy is theoretical. We don't really understand it because, as you pointed out, it's everything around us. We're in it. Now we have context about a struggle for democracy, of people that are fighting for freedom and for liberty, for democratic values, for the ability to have a say in their future and not be subject to a tyrant. Now there's perspective on what this really means. And I think this is, in fact, kind of, I still think, I wish Tim Miller was on here so I could, push back on him, but I still think this is going to be one of those things that it's a game changer in a lot of ways.
I will carry your notes to Tim. I will be sure to let him know.
Yes.
Well, here's the thing. It was so clear across both groups that the Ukrainians have captured the heart of the American people. Just listen to some of these comments.
I love them.
Absolutely amazing, especially when a 60-year-old woman can stand there and tell a soldier from Russia, I'm going to put seeds in your pocket and then kill you. And then the seeds will grow flowers over your dead body.
Right. When the Babushkas take AK-47s.
There you go. Yes, exactly.
I think President Zelensky is a phenomenal leader, too. And I mean, when his line, when he said, I need ammunition, I don't need a ride, like that was such a powerful line.
If Joe Biden had 1% of his spine, America would be okay.
So obviously some of those voters using it as an opportunity to punch Biden, which they never missed an opportunity in that discussion to do. But people are genuinely inspired. At a time when it feels like nothing was going to inspire, we're so polarized and people are so blah, and we've been in years of COVID, and there's a little bit of bloodlust in there too. But they feel this. It's in them. There's something about it that really does resonate with Americans.
So, it's interesting. This is one of the things there's something to be said about political elites. They're very insulated. They talk about, what they think the voters want. They talk about how fuel prices are going to be affected by this, when instead they should be focusing on capturing the spirit of the public. The spirit of the public is behind the Ukrainian people. The spirit of the public is to push back on authoritarianism, to support democracy. I don't understand what this administration is doing, passing up this opportunity to try to bring the American public together. I guess they're just not seeing it the same way. maybe they need to listen to this podcast and learn something from here.
I do think Joe Biden should listen to my podcast. It's been a strong contention of mine. So just as kind of a final piece of this conversation, this is like what I really wanted to ask you. So you listen to these voters and they're basically willing to take the pain at the pump. They want to send money. They want to send guns. They want to arm the Ukrainian people. They basically want to do everything except get involved, right? There's very little appetite for boots on the ground. You have been somebody who has been advocating, maybe as strenuously as anybody I've seen, for more American involvement. Now, I'm not saying you definitely think we should have boots on the ground, but more American involvement. Tease that out for me, like where you are and where you heard from them.
So, I mean, I think I'm consistent with the public. I saw this crisis coming for months, and I thought we needed to do a whole lot more to try to prevent it. I thought we needed to do more with regards to these forced posture changes that are going on now, tens of thousands of U.S. troops pouring into Europe. And that would have been a way to warn off, to deter potentially this war. I thought that there was more we could do with regards to arming Ukraine beforehand. I even thought, frankly, not U.S. soldiers because it's provocative, but this kind of idea of a tripwire force of NATO in Western Ukraine might make sense. Of course, now we're in a completely different paradigm. There is a war. Putin calls it a special military operation, but it's a war. And to put U.S. troops in Ukraine now would not make a great deal of sense. It actually, in a lot of ways, it would violate the fundamental rule that kept us out of World War III during the Cold War, which is we avoided situations that put U.S. and Soviet forces at odds with each other directly. I mean, that's outside the covert space, but we did not say the U.S. Army's here, we're going to fight the Soviet Union. So we need to stick by those rules. But the space between doing that and what we're doing is vast. And I'm with the American people that there's just a hell of a lot more that we could do to arm the Ukrainians to fight this. And that doesn't include necessarily a no-fly zone. I think that's also violates my ground rule. But we could help the Ukrainians establish a no-fly zone. We could give them these Soviet aircraft that are in Poland that we're frankly too scared to provide right now because we think it's provocative. We could provide them with our drones, our armed drones, these unmanned combat aerial vehicles. We give them air defense to knock out Russian planes. We could even the score, or even the playing field rather, so that they could win this on their own. So I'm actually right there. I think at this point, our options are narrowing. And several weeks from now, when this war is continuing, they'll be even more narrow. And we need to make some courageous, risk-informed decisions now, like the American people are suggesting, before we find ourselves drawn into boots on the ground, because the humanitarian catastrophe has become so vast that the outcry from the American people that support the Ukrainians is just overwhelming. That's what I fear happening. We get drawn in, we creep into a war instead of helping to try to bring this to a rapid conclusion.
Yeah, I think that especially we did a lot of focus groups around Afghanistan, and I think obviously there's big lesson there for the American people. There's a lot of fear and trepidation about engaging. We don't want to get in a hot war with another nuclear power, but I do think that having done now a number of groups and listened to people talk about Ukraine, actually, I'll tell you one interesting thing. I did a group right at the very beginning, or maybe like even right before the invasion. We did 2 groups in Texas, a Republican group and a Democratic group. And I remember being really struck because we just asked the boots on the ground question of both groups. And the Democratic group was much more willing than the Republican group, which I just found fascinating from a political realignment. Everybody's switching sides these days. But I think that you're right that Joe Biden runs a risk potentially of seeming to do too little, not necessarily too much, short of direct engagement. It was clear in these groups that people were like, anything we can do to help, to help, and we'll sacrifice for it, which was interesting to see.
I think he's missing that. And his political advisors are overthinking this potential for escalation when in fact, as I've said, I mean, I'm not sure if I said it here, I've said it so many times, the Russians have no interest in a confrontation with the U.S. when they're already bogged down fighting Ukraine. So the threshold for us to go head to head is quite high. There's a lot of room for us to continue to help and satisfy the American people's desire to help.
Well, listen, Alex, it has been such a pleasure having you on today. I appreciate you watching the focus groups. I appreciate you listening to the show. I appreciate you coming on. But most importantly, while I have you here, I just want to tell you that the very first time I saw you was the same time most Americans saw you, which is when you testified for the first time. And I remember listening to your opening speech. you just telling your dad you were going to be okay, you talking about how right matters. And it was one of the most inspiring, moving things. It gave me fuel for months. And just having you on here is such an honor for me.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate those kind words. And every time I hear something like that, I still, I appreciate it. Thanks, Sarah.
All right. Take care. Thanks, everybody. We will be back next week with a new episode of The Focus Group. We'll see you then.
Get an inside look at Hollywood with Michael Rosenbaum.
Let's get inside of Kristen Krug. You would do anything if you love the role.
If it was healthy, I would never want to hurt myself for a role.
Because there's some roles, there's like that guy on Walking Dead, they say he didn't shower a lot, he smelled on set. He wanted to be that kind of character. Could you see yourself doing that?
What's the point? Isn't that what makeup's for?
Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, it's Rich Eisen, and my first guest of season 3 of Just Getting Started happens to be the new host of this podcast, my better half, Susie Schuster. You've got one of the most unique stories of how you got started, so why don't you come across the hall, take the chair, and oh boy, wait a minute, I think I locked the door. That's not a metaphor for anything.
How's the lighting in here? I mean, I'm vain, So I thought for the first season, try to bring you people I thought were diverse and different and maybe interesting, and that's why I started off with Jeffrey Ross, the comedian. And then, we've got a bunch of other asks out, making Paul Rudd do it. Sorry, Paul, do you know that you're doing it? And I want this to be inspirational. Life is really hard right now, and sometimes you just need a little bit of help, someone to reach out their hand and pull you along, or to push you from behind and say, you can do this. And I'm hoping that's what you're going to get from Just Getting Started.
Go follow Just Getting Started wherever you get your favorite shows.